The 2D Pokemon games are often regarded as some of the greatest games in the franchise, but not all of them are created equal. While certain games changed the landscape of Pokemon, others suffered from various problems including questionable game design and hardware issues. With that in mind, I've decided to rank all of these games. Now, before we begin, I should explain my mindset towards making this list. Everyone has their own biased opinions towards these games. After all, the ones we played growing up are always going to be viewed a little bit more fondly than the others. While I can't completely disregard personal bias, I did my best to negate this by playing through almost all of these games again this past year. That being said, I'll judge these games with a combination of my own opinions, the general consensus of the community, and the objective quality of the games relative to its time period. Oh, and one more thing, I'll be ranking these games based off their definitive versions in their own generation. For example, Gen 2 is represented by Crystal, not Gold and Silver. Also, remakes will be considered their own games since the two present in the 2D era changed so much from the originals. So now, let's start this off with the worst 2D Pokemon games, Red, Blue, and Yellow. I mean, can you really blame me for having these last? I want to be clear and say that I don't actually think any Pokemon game on this list is bad. I've had my fair share of enjoyment from Gen 1, although it is quite bare bones. Before tearing into these games, I have to acknowledge how important they were to Pokemon as a franchise. Obviously, these were the titles to start it all, and without them, we wouldn't have gotten any of the great games we have today. But just being the first wouldn't have caused all the worldwide craze on the scale in which it did. So, of course, it did something right on release. In my opinion, this was the amount of connection it brought to the youth. While it took a few steps, Pokemon allowed for trading and battling among friends, and while this seems normal now, at the time it was sort of like an augmented reality experience. The fact that you could plug in a cable and transport your team to someone else's game was surreal. You could imagine how much a kid would identify with their Pokemon team, and honestly, I think a modern day equivalent to this would be like skins in Fortnite or something. Jokes aside, the culture these games had around them was just as important as the gameplay. Alongside the game was the anime and trading card game, which gave people even more reason to get invested into these games. The anime became so popular that I can almost guarantee that if you were around when it was coming out, you probably have the entire opening memorized. As great as this all was, looking at the actual game now, it is obviously a very raw experience. Many moves are broken, typings are strange, the sprites are ugly. Honestly, there's a lot of problems. Even in Pokemon Yellow, which changed the game to reflect the anime, most of the issues were still present. But it's not like these problems came after years of trial and error. This was the first attempt after all. So yeah, while the gameplay is questionable in this generation, the impact was arguably more than any other. Next up on my list is Pokemon Crystal, and no, this isn't just going to be ranked in chronological order, I promise. Gen 2 expanded heavily on the first, and Crystal is the definitive version of that. In Gold and Silver alone, there was now Pokemon breeding, held items, an internal clock, special attack and defense, steel and dark types, and much more. Things only got better in Crystal when they added perhaps the most important thing at the time, a female character option. It's not that girls didn't play Pokemon before this, but now they could feel even more connected to the experience. Other changes in Crystal included new animated sprites, improved region design, and many aesthetic improvements as well. As for the actual gameplay itself, things are more or less the same conceptually as Gen 1. The major difference was surely the brand new region of Johto to explore in addition to Kanto in the postgame. This massive amount of gameplay was insane, especially considering all of the new Pokemon they added to the game. Johto itself was much more of a culturally influenced region than Kanto, with a heavy focus on Japan and its traditions. Just take a look at Ecruteak City and compare that to how Saffron City looks in Pokemon Red. The improvements cannot be denied. Despite all of this though, the game is ultimately far from what Pokemon was going to become, not to mention all of the problems the game had on its own. While this point will be expanded on later in this list when we get to Heart Gold Soul Silver, Johto suffers from a lot of problems regarding leveling and certain aspects of region design. I still think this game is great, just certainly not the most optimal way to play Johto. Next on the list is Fire Red and Leaf Green, and this is the point where pretty much any game I rank going forward is amazing in my opinion. This was one of my first Pokemon games, and I definitely think it is the best way to play through the Kanto region. Everything great from the original games is back and better than ever. The game takes place in the third generation, meaning that aside from the aesthetic changes, there were now natures, abilities, running shoes, IVs and EVs, and many other minor things. As for the new major changes specifically for Kanto, Fire Red and Leaf Green added a national dex, wireless connectivity, which at the time was actually quite revolutionary, a female character, the Versus Seeker, berries, and perhaps the coolest thing, the Sevi Islands, a brand new section of the game to explore. Honestly, it is a shame this game had such harsh competition on the list because I could see this being way higher. To be honest, the biggest issues with this game almost have nothing to do with the quality of the remake. Everything has essentially been improved, from the gameplay balancing to the music. I would say the thing that keeps it lower on the list is the lack of innovation beyond the originals in the main story. The Sevii Islands were a great addition, don't get me wrong, especially combined with the national decks, but it feels very vanilla in the main adventure. While this does make the game quite replayable, it still wouldn't blow anyone away. The story and fights are basically identical to Red and Blue, although it is much more fun with the new gameplay changes, particularly in battle. I don't have much to say about this besides that though. It's just one of those games that did exactly what it needed to do at the time, which was bring Gen 1 to modern consoles. This ranking might shock some people, but I got Pokemon Platinum next. I feel like we've reached the part of the list where I might start to actually offend people's favorite games, but let me reiterate, these next titles are all amazing. When Gen 4 was released, Diamond and Pearl brought Pokemon to the Nintendo DS. Unfortunately, it was kind of a rocky start. Commercially, I wouldn't say that the games did poorly, but the games themselves were not very optimized. While they brought amazing new additions like online play and the physical special move split, the mechanical performance of the gameplay was sluggish and borderline unplayable if your attention span was too low. Whether it was the pacing, battling, or surf speed, everything was slow. This wasn't the only issue though. Problems like a limited Pokédex, a mediocre storyline, and a strange region design plagued Diamond and Pearl as well. That's why when Platinum released, it changed everything. There are genuinely so many changes that it made to the games that I cannot read everything off without making this segment ridiculously long. But to summarize, they added dozens of new Pokemon, increased the speed of gameplay in all areas, improved the aesthetics of both battles and the overworld, and perhaps the coolest change, drastically changed the storyline. The main plot involves several more characters, and the build-up to the climax of the story is well developed. They even added an entire new area of the game for this part of the story, the Distortion World. This version of Gen 4 makes Diamond and Pearl seem like useless entries in the franchise. The crazy thing is that I only listed off the most important changes, but there is still a laundry list of other minor fixes and additions that make Platinum so much better. I still don't think that this version completely fixes all the problems Gen 4 had though. There is still a lack of variety in the Pokemon you can get, the region design is inherently slow in some areas, particularly in the snowy regions of Sinnoh, HMs are way overused, and the power scaling is odd. I will say though, Platinum is a lot better than people might give it credit, and I think it has great vibes. Not to mention, it has one of my favorite soundtracks in all of Pokemon as well. The next game on the list is another one that might be up for debate, but I have Heart Gold Soul Silver. Before I say anything here, I want to establish a thesis of sorts for this section. This game was so incredibly atmospheric to play through, but it suffers from some of the worst nostalgia blindness in the entire series. I know that might sound a little negative for a game ranked this high, but I promise it will all make sense. First, let's talk about the context of this game's existence. Heart Gold and Soul Silver are the remakes of Gen 2, and in a way, that means it was a remake of both Johto and Kanto. Of course, developers knew how precious the memories of those original games were, and as a result, they wanted to preserve a lot of them. At the same time though, they wanted to make sure that this felt like a brand new adventure and not just a standard remake, something I'd say Fire Red and Leaf Green somewhat suffered from. As a result of this thought process, we got some of the most well thought out atmospheres in a video game. Whether it's the music, visuals, or storyline, everything was focused on the connections between people and Pokemon. This is one of the only games where you're allowed to walk with your Pokemon behind you. Even in real life, they wanted players to feel connected with their Pokemon, allowing you to take them out with the Pokewalker. Growing up, Heart Gold was always my favorite Pokemon game because of all the great vibes it brought to me. But recently, I played it again, and well, it's not actually as great as I remember. I don't say that meaning it's bad in any way. Trust me, this game is head and shoulders above most Pokemon adventures. But there's a lot of nostalgia at play too. I mean, if you think about it, of course the game where the theme is heart and soul is going to be the most nostalgic. I also think it's important to acknowledge the many faults in this game as well. The worst offender is the leveling system. This is notoriously bad in Johto, and if there was anything to fix in a remake, it would be this, and yet it is still a massive issue. While the game starts off balanced, it quickly falls apart as you make it to Ecruteak City, and the levels of your Pokemon versus the wild Pokemon vary quite literally by the dozens. By the end of Johto, even if you're not using a full team of 6, you will still be under-leveled assuming you played through the entire game normally. The thing is, there is nowhere to efficiently train except for the Elite Four. So your best bet by the end of the main story is just fighting them over and over again until you're strong enough to win it all. The storyline of Johto is also weird. Team Rocket is the main evil team, which is fine, but there isn't a clear goal or leader to get attached to. They just kind of exist and you fight them as they do bad stuff. The main boss isn't even someone of importance, just some dude who really liked Giovanni. The main story is probably more about your progression to be a strong and kind trainer, which is cool, I guess. I just wish that there was more with Team Rocket. As for Kanto, it has problems of its own. First of all, there's just a strange vibe here. It feels like not that many people live here anymore. Cinnabar Island is destroyed, and the pace is just so fast, it's like you're passing through beating the gym leaders and that's it. I don't know if this was intentional or just rushed development, but I am not a fan of this Kanto. I know I've said a lot of negative things about these games, but the fact is that it's this high on the list for a reason. All of its positives outweigh the negatives. It also helps that these games included all of the new massive features included in Gens 3 and 4. Next on the list, in my number 3 spot, is Pokemon Emerald. Now you may be wondering, how did a game from the 3rd generation find its way above both Pokemon Platinum and Heart Gold? And no, it's not because of nostalgia, because this game came out before I was even born. To be honest, I don't really know the reason. My history with this game is actually pretty recent. Up until earlier this year, I had actually never played Emerald before, only Omega Ruby. Don't get me wrong, I love the Gen 3 remakes as much as the next guy, but I felt like I had to give Emerald a try. And wow, that was the best decision ever. First of all, let's just say how incredible this game looks and sounds for being on the GBA. I thought that since the GBA had some strange sounding speakers that the soundtrack would hurt my ears, but it didn't feel bad at all. I definitely think that the remakes have a superior soundtrack, although I would hope so since they were made a decade later. Looking at its gameplay, I think it has a perfect balance of everything it could have had at the time. That's what it really is, honestly. It doesn't have many glaring faults like the previous games had. This isn't to say it doesn't have problems though. There is a lot of water and the HM usage is crazy. The selection of Pokemon here isn't that amazing, although that is subjective. And the overall pacing can be strange at times. Besides that though, I don't think there are many problems if you don't count certain features just not existing in Pokemon yet. I also gave this game a gigantic boost in credibility for being the first to introduce the competitive side of Pokemon. Without Emerald, there would be no massive VGC tournaments today. The introduction of abilities, natures, EVs, and IVs all help to make Pokemon a genuinely competitive game. Emerald brings a different kind of difficulty to the franchise that in a way hasn't been replicated since. I mean, the Battle Frontier alone could be considered a game of its own. The story and region design are also quite commendable in Emerald, really focusing on how people interact with nature and the world around them. This ties in well with the evil teams in the game who strive to change the nature of the world with the legendary Pokemon. So yeah, while Emerald is a pretty old game at this point, it manages to be in my top 3 for 2D Pokemon games. And well, if you've made it to this point in the video, you can guess there's only 2 games left, and they're both in Unova. But for the runner-up spot, I have to give it to the first Black and White games. These are perhaps the most controversial games in the entire series. Some people feel like they ruined the franchise by making a whole new Pokedex of only Unovan Pokemon for the main game. At the same time though, people loved this change and felt as if it breathed new life into the franchise. I would say I fall into the latter category of people. Pokemon Black and White was one of the first Pokemon games I played growing up, so maybe I didn't have a lot of nostalgia making me dislike the lack of older Pokemon, but even now I like how isolated it feels. It does make a ton of sense after all, since Unova is supposed to be in the New York area of the United States, literally across the world from all the other Japanese influenced regions. If the options for team building were bad or limited, I would understand people being upset, but that's not the case here. There are plenty of options to build your team, and I could say they did a good job at making sure each type got good representation. Besides that, a big complaint people have about this game is the linearity of the region, and this does make sense. You basically never get an option from straying from the path, which I suppose is pretty different from the previous games. In fact, you could make the case that this game's linearity would influence all of the games that came after it to be very similar in that sense. I think in this game specifically though, it works. The story and the evil team's role in your adventure is a major reason for this linearity. The game tries to explore the morality of Pokemon as a whole, and as you progress through the story, you hear different perspectives of how people view and treat their Pokemon. By the end of the adventure, you fought back against the pessimistic ideals spoken about by Team Plasma, and instead fight for the idea that people and Pokemon need each other. As for the more mechanical changes, I would say that Gen 5 added the least big things compared to previous entries. To be fair, it still did change a lot of minor things which added up to be pretty important. For example, the overall visuals of Gen 5 look drastically better than Gen 4 despite the games being on the same console. There are brand new constant battle animations, and the camera is a lot more dynamic in the overworld. The music is also a lot more complex, with many tracks having significantly more layers and instruments than previous games did. While I do believe that the sequel of this game is slightly better, Pokemon Black and White is still amazing. And finally, the best 2D Pokemon game in my opinion is Pokemon Black and White 2. This might be a little predictable since it is the final 2D Pokemon game ever made, but the greatness cannot be denied. Everything good about Black and White basically carries over here, except now there's a ton of more content. First of all, there is a brand new section of the region that you have to go through before reaching the cities from Black and White. This area is a really well made collection of towns that have a new yet familiar vibe to them. Another new addition to this game is the amount of Pokemon from different regions in the main story. In the first few hours of the game alone, you can get your hands on a Riolu, Growlithe, Mareep, and many more. The amount of team building options that you have in the game as it progresses was unmatched in any other Pokemon game up to this point. As for the story, the game takes place 2 years after the events of the first adventure, and there are plenty of callbacks to it. Certain routes and towns are differently designed, and important trainers look different too. The major plot of this game also revisits Team Plasma in a new way. Aside from all these major differences though, Black and White 2 made a couple minor changes that improved the experience as a whole. They redesigned some Pokemon sprites, gave trainers and moves new animations in battle, and the UI is generally better. The one thing I haven't mentioned yet though is actually the most important thing: the Pokemon World Tournament. While not the first competitive area in the game's history, its inclusion in the game is one of the reasons why I have this game at number 1. The premise of this place is essentially the same as the Battle Frontier, where you have to fight increasingly difficult battles. The difference is that in this game you can battle almost every important trainer in the game's history. You start off against the gym leaders of each region, and then you can fight in the Champions Tournament where you fight some of the hardest battles in all of Pokemon. These battles are so difficult you will need to utilize every resource the game gives you to win. In general, the reason why I love Black and White so much over all of the others, including its original game, is because this sequel has everything the original had, plus more. With my list complete, I'd really like to know what your rankings are, so feel free to leave a comment with your list, or you could just tell me how bad mine was if you want. Regardless, I don't believe any Pokemon game in the 2D era was bad. Maybe a little mediocre at times, but certainly not bad. As for the 3D games though, well, I don't know if I could say the same.